welcome to the S.O.A.P video series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. We have been working our way through the book of Romans.
Right.
And we're
pretty far along.
Yeah, we really are, right? Yeah. This is week six out of seven. Week 6 out of 7, which brings almost to the end. Right. We've got a tiny bit to finish up in chapter 11. We'll do 12 and 13. 13 is actually a short chapter. Yep. Get into 14 a little bit this week.
So it seems like a lot of reading. But,
it seems like a lot, yeah.
It's really not that bad.
And it's really good anyway. So.
Yeah, no, it really is. And that's actually what I like about these, right? Because it forces me to read it and study it enough to at least try to talk about it somewhat intelligently. Yeah. And obviously we're not covering everything, but have to understand it enough to get what we feel are the key points out. Right. But like we always say, there's a lot more in here that we're not doing anything with.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes we just give a summary, and sometimes we're hitting some big points. Yep. It depends on the reading. We're just coming out, or we're just finishing chapters 9, 10, and 11, which stands alone as a set. If you think of the book of Romans in 3 sections, chapters 1 through 8, and then 9 through 11, and then 12 through 16. We're 9 through 11 is really about the nation of Israel.
Right.
And I said past, present, future for those 3 chapters. We're finishing up chapter 11, and then we're moving on to really this whole new section where he changes gears again.
Yeah. And you've equated this to the path a number of times, and it's really cool because I didn't see it. Well, this week you see it. It's kind of hard not to see it this week, at least part of it, but I can easily miss things. But salvation was really the first about 5 chapters of Romans, where Paul is just taking his time. What does it mean to accept Christ in your life? What happens, and working through all those questions.
And why we need it.
Yeah. Which
he spends 3
awesome.
Chapters on sin.
Yeah, you are bad. It turns out everybody's bad.
Who knew?
Yeah. And then excellence, the second step, is covered by chapters 6 through 8. Yeah. So I don't know if he was intentional or not, or whether we're just kind of reading into it, but sure seems like he's walking through part of the path. Yeah. And not so much with Israel, with those chapters, but we're picking up again in 12, and we'll definitely see knowledge and what we call a loop in there with perseverance or self-control, perseverance, and godliness. But then also you bring out brotherly affection and unselfish love in there.
Yeah, it spins right out. Yeah, and that's really what I like about the path, because in 2 Peter, it really is just a condensed one-line version of what the rest of the New Testament already teaches. Right. It's not like we're coming to Romans and saying, can we find the path in here? It's that Romans is like the whole thing that, and in other places, that Peter just summarizes. Right. And so if we know the summary, then we do start to see it everywhere else.
In all the places. Yeah, so kind of cool. So we start this week talking about Israel, or finishing with Israel, and like you said, we're really talking about the future. Yeah. And there's a couple questions in here, and the first one is this really a rejection? Because it's now we're talking about Paul taking the salvation, the gospel message to the Gentiles. Yeah. So has God rejected Israel? Right. And Paul's, a resounding no. Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
We had talked before, does God have the right to harden Israel's heart as a whole, as a nation? Yeah. And we came to the conclusion, yes. Yeah. Why? Because God said he would. God said he did, and what he does is good.
And it's really interesting that Paul says that it's a partial hardening. Yeah. Because there's this, what we have to understand is there's a difference between Israel as a nation and individual Jews.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. And individual Jews can still accept Christ into their lives.
Right. Or the rest of chapter 11 wouldn't make sense. If we're supposed to provoke them to jealousy, wouldn't matter if they can't respond at all. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, good point.
But as a nation, Israel is not going to return to God until during what we call the tribulation period, the 7 years, the 70th week of Daniel. And then when Jesus comes back, especially at that second coming, all Israel is looking toward him as Messiah, Savior, finally. Right. But during this time, he says there's a partial hardening, and it's really interesting until the full number of Gentiles comes in. Seems to me that God says, there's X number of Gentiles that are going to be saved during this church age. At that time, the rapture happens and the rest of the prophetic timeline starts going again. So God knows when that is. I don't know when that is. You don't.
Right.
So our job is share the gospel and make disciples.
Yep.
That's all we can do.
Yeah. Yeah. And, we try to have fun. We try to look ahead. The older I get, the more it seems like it's imminent. But it seems like it's been that way for 2,000 years, too.
Yep.
Yeah. So the last thing, why would God do this? But you already answered it, right? It's on his path. It's what he is doing. Specifically, he, and Paul brings it up a number of times in this chapter, getting Israel jealous.
So that they will respond.
Yeah.
So Jews will respond.
But the focus is shifting away from them. Nobody wants focus shifted away from you. I want to be the center of the stage. What do I have to do? What am I missing out on to get their attention?
Yeah.
And like we said, individuals can still accept Christ in their life.
So you mentioned these several questions that have come up. Is God right to do this? Is it okay? Is it fair? Is it whatever? And we've tried to explain this, and Paul has tried to explain it, and he's used different illustrations. But he gets down to the end of this section, and I love the last four verses of chapter 11. It's sort of a benediction, but it's also a reminder that as much as God wants us to know him, there's a point at which we just...
It's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. We just can't. Starting in verse 33, oh, the depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments. How unfathomable his ways. It reminds me of Isaiah 55. We're supposed to seek the Lord while he may be found. Come near to him, or respond to him while he is still near. But who has known the mind of the Lord? His ways are higher than ours. His thoughts are higher than ours. And I wonder if Paul was reflecting on that. For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen.
Right.
The book could have ended there.
Yeah. Maybe he did that day.
He came back later
day.
And he's like, okay,
hey, now we gotta keep going. But also from the past standpoint, knowing that in our lifetime here, we're never going to get to the end. So we want to get closer to God, understand him better, know him more, knowing that we'll never know him perfectly.
Well, and in 1 John 3, it says that we will be like him when we see him, right? So Paul says it, John says it. This loop, and the way we say it here, is it's a lifelong loop.
Yeah.
Right? We just keep going through it, which is okay,
Yeah.
Know him better, love him more, not know him fully, and then we're done,
Well, and it's also, we as human beings don't do good when we learn the lesson early and we have another 50 years to go. We get bored.
Yeah.
Right. So being able to, and as painful as some of these lessons are, being able to learn the lessons as we go along actually helps and keeps us interested.
Yeah, and of course it builds on each other, and there's stuff that today, that I know today, that we couldn't possibly have known 30 years ago. So. Yep.
And so that gets us into chapter 12. Chapter 12, I started with, it's a section on knowledge, and it is in here. You pointed out, hold on a minute. Really, it's about brotherly affection, really it's about excellence at first.
Yeah, the first two verses present your bodies to God as a living sacrifice, almost word for word to a point. In chapter 6, present your bodies as instruments of righteousness. So it's sort of like he's done the section on Israel, and now he's sort of picking back up where he left off in chapter 8.
Right.
So he grabs a couple of things. He says, okay, here's what we were talking about. Yeah. Therefore, because of all of this, do this, and now let's unpack the rest of the path.
Yeah. So what I really like too, present your body as a living sacrifice, because it's a reasonable thing to do.
It's a reasonable
service,
yep.
and to me that really hits hard. Something, I need to make myself better.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a reasonable thing to do.
Yeah.
And it is.
Yeah. The word translated service there is translated worship in other places. And so it's really the concept of it's our reasonable worship. It's a reasonable act of worship to do this, to be transformed, to not be conformed to the world, be conformed. That word conformed, again, is a tie back to chapter 8, where he said he wants us to be conformed to the image of Christ. Now he says, don't be conformed to the world. Present your body, connects to chapter 6. I mean, there's a ton of, it's like we're skipping over 9 through 11 for a second, tying back to excellence, and almost like a rubber band, and then he shoots straight out, starting with verse 3, into the rest of the rest of the path.
Right. So the excellence is the decision we make. There's more.
Yeah.
I want to do more.
Yeah.
I want, God is asking me to do this. He says it's reasonable.
Yep.
But it's up to us to say yes.
Yep. All in. I'm all in. I don't know what it looks like for the next 50 years, but I'm all in, and I'm going to let God do his work.
Yeah, so being the sacrifice, but then also we know that we have to live in this world.
Yeah.
But doesn't mean we have to be of this world.
Right.
I always like it kind of put that way, and Paul puts it, don't be conformed by the world.
Yep.
So we have to be able to test things. Hey, what does God say about this? But in order for us to apply that test, we have to have knowledge.
Right.
You just can't say, well, it feels right. Well, actually, we do it all the time,
We
right?
do it all the time.
But we shouldn't
Unfortunately.
do that.
That seems right. Why would that,
Yeah, so we have to have that knowledge to be able to apply it to the various tests. And as our knowledge grows, that application is different.
Yep.
And it's part of that loop.
Yep.
So, of course, because we're human, as we gain more knowledge, as we do things, I get conceited. I'm better than everyone else. So there's some great reminders in here that we need to be humble.
Yeah.
And God has given us these gifts. And it's up to us to hone these gifts. It's up to gain knowledge about these gifts and use these gifts that he's given us. But he gave them to us.
Yeah. And it's for the purpose of building up other people.
Right.
Sounds an awful lot like brotherly affection to me.
Yeah. Right.
Why are we doing this loop? Why are we going through this stuff?
Well, even unselfish love, taking the gospel message forward. And if we are given some gifts, whatever those gifts are, it helps us in both those endeavors.
Yeah. So verses 3 through 8 is really about the spiritual gifts, a lot of brotherly affection. Verses 9 through 21 is really interesting because it starts with fellow believers and then it shifts to unbelievers. So we've got both brotherly affection and unselfish love in there. Yep. And it's really interesting. The difference is what he says. You can almost.
It's also a section on love, right?
Yeah.
In there?
Yeah. But it's and that's what it is. It's how we love fellow Christians versus how we love the rest of the world, and the expectations that are on us is different for those two groups, and what we should expect from those two groups is also different.
Yeah. Which is nice.
Yeah. Verse 18 is probably one of the greatest principles in the whole chapter, and that is, if possible. I mean, there's so much contingent in this verse. If possible, so far as it depends on you.
Yeah, right. So we're too deep now.
Live peaceably with all people, because sometimes it's not possible.
Right.
And that's all people, so that's in the unselfish love side of things, everywhere, not just fellow Christians. So if possible, sometimes it's not. And so far as it depends on you, which reminds us that we are in charge of only our side of any relationship.
Right.
We can't control the other side. Some people will never want to live in peace with us. We just do what we know we're supposed to do.
We make the offer.
Yeah. And
and if it's rejected, it's not on us.
Yep.
Right. So then chapter 13 goes to submit to the government.
Yep.
Which is interesting because you can apply that any way you want, and people do.
Yeah.
So this is an always thing. You always have to listen to the people in charge of the government.
Everything they say, whatever they tell you to do, you have to obey it.
Right. But we just got out of, we need to be able to test.
Yeah.
Right. So not that we test our government officials, but we need to test what they're asking us to do.
Yeah.
And is this reasonable from a God point of view?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really, Paul, he only wrote 7 verses on this, so it's not like we're building an entire doctrine of human government from these 7 verses. But one of the principles is that government serves a specific purpose. God is the one who established it. We go all the way back to Genesis 9, and God established human government. So it's not sinful. It's not, it's obviously under Satan's control and power and,
Right.
The God of this world. But God established it for a reason. And it's really interesting that if you read Romans 13 and you read Genesis 9, the purpose of human government was to punish wrongdoers, to keep evil out of society. Okay, our government's a little bit bigger than that, right?
Yeah.
So how much of that, at the very least, we have to obey that part because that's why they exist. The problem is that as humans are increasingly wicked, human government is increasingly wicked,
Right.
and what they call right and wrong,
Right.
and what they punish as wrong is not necessarily what we call right and wrong, which goes back to what you said. We have to discern. And sometimes a Christian has to look at the government and say, well, you're just wrong. Well, we're going to punish you for that. I guess I have to take the punishment because I'm not going to do what you say. I'm just not going to do it. And he here in chapter 13 does not give many things that he doesn't list. He doesn't say everything. He lists only a couple of 2 or 3 things
Right.
that he specifically places Christians in subjection to the government. So, number 1, we're not building an entire doctrine. Number 2, let's not add a bunch of stuff that Paul didn't add.
Right.
Let's start there,
Yep.
and then the rest of it really does come to a matter of conscience, which we're going to see in the next couple of chapters as well.
Yep. So one of the things here, Paul said, we're close, right? So we're close to this whole thing shutting down.
Yep.
What we'd equate to the second coming. That was 2,000 years ago.
Yep.
How do we deal with that?
We deal with we call the doctrine of imminency, and the doctrine of imminency says it could be any time, and that means that it could have been any time for Paul. And he was living under that, and here we are, almost 2,000 years later, still under that same doctrine. It could be any time. It doesn't mean that it's close, like on the timeline, because it may not be close on it certainly wasn't close for him, but it was imminent. And so the principle is live as if it could happen at any time, because it could happen at any time because you don't know the time.
Okay, good.
Right? And but his principle, or what he does say, our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. Well, that's true. I mean, I believed 40 years ago.
Yep, we're closer.
We're closer than it was. Okay, now is it going to be another 2,000 years? I don't know. Jesus said, "I'm coming quickly." Good for you.
Definitions are a little different.
Yeah, a little bit. We live not with the doctrine of the soon coming of Jesus, but we live with the doctrine of the imminent coming of Jesus. It could be today. And his question is, if it could be today, since it could be today, that should affect how we live.
Right. Yeah, good point. He uses light and dark as his example. Jesus used that all over the place.
Yep.
Live in the light and not the dark. And I also like he emphasizes don't give the bad side even a chance.
Yeah.
And in my own life, and so I got to believe other people do the same thing. Sometimes we give sin too much of a chance.
Yeah.
Or even that little inroad.
Yeah.
And then, if you never allowed it in the first place, you'd be so much better off.
Right. Yeah. Keep the door locked. And
Yeah.
right. Instead of
be
an open door.
vigilant.
Yeah. Open door policy. Come on in.
Yep. Okay. So we get into chapter 14.
Yep.
And we're only doing the first 12 verses,
This
but
week,
a lot of 14 is together.
Yep.
And I read it, and what I got out of it is it looks like in Paul's time that there were vegans that were whiny. Right? Because he specifically points
The Bible
out,
never
hey, you
changes."
people that eat fruit and vegetables only, give other people a chance. So I'm not sure that was the right application out of it, but that was the first thing I got.
Nice.
But I do think what Paul is talking about here is Christian to Christians.
Yep.
And a lot of us are Christians. We're talking to a lot of Christians. And guess what? Our values are different.
Yep.
So Paul says it's okay.
Yeah.
And Paul says, hey, you that are more mature Christians, give a lot of grace to new Christians, because new Christians, they're hot and I have to do this, I have to do that. They'll figure it out.
Yep, and they're wrestling with a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff that becomes new to them.
Yep.
And unfortunately,
It's like a teenager is the way I equate it.
Yeah. Right? Just because somebody has been saved for a long time doesn't mean they're mature.
Yeah, it's spiritual maturity.
It's spiritual maturity. So he's really, you who are mature, he's on our spiritual maturity clock, he's talking to young people and parents dealing with toddlers and children, infants and children in their spiritual maturity, right? And the principle, the whole thing, we'll read all of chapters, 14 and 15, over the next couple weeks, but the principle really comes out in chapter 14, verse 4. Who are you to pass judgment on another person's servant?
Right.
If you and I have a difference of opinion on something, what we eat, how we dress, what music, all of these things.
So let's take that for a minute. I'm assuming we're talking about non-doctrinal things.
Yes. Yeah, we're talking about matters of preference.
Right. Me fasting or not fasting, or I avoid this whole section of foods because God told me to. Right. Right. Or even what day I want to worship.
Right. And so those are two exact examples. He says some people want this day, some people want this day. Okay, if you're doing it for God, I don't really care, because the day doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The day doesn't matter at all. Paul says so. He says some people want to eat fruits and vegetables, some people want to eat meat. Why are we arguing about this? Now, some people are going to be really, really strongly opinionated about their thing. Yep. Fine, be strongly opinionated about it. But you who are not opinionated about it, don't judge them. And you who are, don't judge everybody else.
Right. Yeah. That's where the vegan thing comes in.
Stop the bickering about this stuff. Yes, doctrine. You're right. Doctrine, absolutely. We need to be unified on doctrine. We call out bad doctrine. We teach good doctrine.
Right.
But there are matters of conscience.
But the little stuff.
Yeah, there are matters of conscience and preference.
I would even say, in the past 30 years, that would equate to bringing drums into the church.
It can be a lot of,
and moving the piano, and I was like, whoa, that can't be right.
It can be a lot of different things. Just even what entertainment do you allow into your home, for your children? Right. Somebody else is, we would never watch that or read that or listen to that. Okay, that's fine. Now if it's satanic, if it's pagan, if it's bad, it's bad doctrine. There are certain things that I won't watch just because, doctrinally it is so bad. I'm just like, ugh, And there are some things that I'll watch or I'll listen to that other people will be like, how could you watch and listen to that? Because I know it's purely for entertainment. I'm not getting any doctrine. This is not changing my life, and I need a way to turn off my brain and just like, okay,
And then next week, I think we also learn, he rephrases it. More mature people don't put an obstacle in the way of somebody younger.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to do by saying, well, that's not right. Or, planting something in somebody's mind. They'll get to that point. They'll figure it out. They'll soften. They'll change.
Yeah. And we can spend more time on that next week's reading, but for this week, it's serve God, because this comes back to chapter 12. Test it prove it, test it, present your body to God, and if you're doing what you're doing to God, right?
Yeah.
Then who am I to come over here and say, no, you're not doing that to God?
Yeah.
Or for God. Right. It's like, come on, this is your reasonable worship that you think is reasonable, that you've tried to do your best, and I come along and blow that up?
Yeah.
Paul says, don't you dare. Yeah. Don't you dare. You're not serving me, I'm not serving. I mean, that's where spiritual gifts are for, but your worship is not to me and mine is not to you.
Yeah. So we're going to have an interpretive dance on Sunday?
If you want to do an are you going to do an interpretive dance?
Might take me a couple weeks.
So, who are you serving? Why are you serving? You know, I assume God would be your answer. Why are you serving him? How are you serving him? Do that to the best of your ability. And
It's your reasonable service.
that's your reasonable service. And let God take care of the rest of it. You know, maybe you're wrong in an area. You know, maybe that isn't as big of a deal as you thought it was. Okay, well,
Right.
let God and, you know, change
you
you
gotta
over
work through it.
time. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. You know, do the best that you can right now. And that's what the baby steps are, and that's what the path is. What do I know today? You know, how can I serve God and love God and know God today? Not what am I going to do for the next 30 years?
Right.
You know, and just go on from there.
All right.
So hopefully that's beneficial. Hopefully as you do this reading and think back on this video, hopefully you're like, oh, that makes so much more sense now. I can actually do that. It's not as hard as maybe some people have tried to make it. And you can grow a little bit because of our time in Romans this week. So with that, I'm sure there's somebody else who could appreciate and use it as well. So be sure to share it with them. Share it all over your social media. And we'll be back next time to finish up the book of Romans. Woo. Yay! And then eventually...
It's always good to finish a book.
Yeah. 7 weeks in Romans is not quite long enough, but it's good for our little survey here.
Yep.
See you next time.
Bye.